Order. I call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session on UK's contribution to European security. And it is wonderful to have with us three prominent individuals within the defence industry to give evidence. First of all, Craven, welcome to you as the Chief Executive of ADS. We also have with us Julian, the CEO of techUK, and also Andrew Kinniburgh, the Director General of Make UK Defence. A warm welcome to all of your good selves. And without further ado, let's get on to the questions. So, gents, in your view, I think some of us will know the answer, but in your view, what role does the defence industry play in the UK's deterrence posture? Who would like to make a start? Mr. Kinniburgh?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Huge deterrence effect. You could almost argue, I think, that it's almost as important as having the armed forces as having a really strong back room in terms of the defence supply chain. So I think in the UK it's absolutely key. We're not yet on a war footing in the UK with the defence supply chain. I think we need to move quickly to try and get to there, where we have capacity and spare capacity and surge capacity in the supply chain. So I think it's a huge deterrent effect, and we need to move much more quickly to establish that surge capability, both within the primes and also within the mid-tiers and the SMEs.
Mr. David?
So just a little bit of background about techUK, because that may not have the obvious defence in its title, but we have 1,100 member companies, about 700 of those are SMEs, and we are the voice of the tech industry in the UK. And why that matters is because defence is increasingly about digital technology, the deployment of that, both in the existing weapon systems and platforms, but also in the new forms of warfare, electronic warfare, cybersecurity, etc. And the UK is very well placed in respect to that, because we do have a very significant and well-regarded technology industry here in the UK. It's a $1 trillion industry, $1 trillion industry, excuse me. We have the third largest capability in AI, and you're seeing AI now become pervasive across the battle space and also in the national defence and security. And so the idea that we do have that capability and it can be deployed in defence, I think, is really significant. In terms of what we do, we are members of the Defence Suppliers Forum, and we represent a lot of SMEs and a lot of tech companies there. And we have very strong relationships across the MOD, particularly with Strategic Command and obviously Defence Digital. And we're very pleased to work with colleagues from other associations in bringing that capacity to the use of the UK defence.
Mr. Craven?
So thank you, Chair. I'm with Jens Stoltenberg, who said, without industry there is no defence, no deterrence and no security. And that broadly remains very true and relevant today. The UK's has 164,000 jobs directly in defence and probably 3 times that number indirectly. We are one of the largest defence industries in Europe, and that capability and that capacity is critical to Europe, albeit that at the moment we have a number of political differences that make it difficult to use that in a coherent way.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to build upon what you just said there, Mr. Craven. In terms of, there has been considerable criticism of European governments of not being able to step up to the plate. In fact, I think it was Dr. Watling of RUSI who intimated that it should be a matter of embarrassment in Europe today that while many defence enterprises have expanded their capacity to produce shells over the last 18 months, order books at Europe's defence companies are far from full. So it's eminently clear to many of us that we are not, as governments within Europe, making full use of that industrial base. But I wanted to ask your good self a question. Do you think that the British taxpayer, or taxpayers generally, are getting value for money from the defence industrial base? I'll say that because the NATO chief of the Military Council suggested that industry could do more to speed up production. In his words, they need to work faster. It should be a wake-up call to the industry. They are still in the old mentality in which earning money was a big issue. So is it a case that the governments or the British taxpayer is not getting value for buck, value for their pound, because things are not being produced fast enough or cheap enough? Mr. Kinniburgh?
It's a good challenge, Chair. I think it's a many-faceted challenge, I think. We're certainly very wedded to the large primes in the UK. And whilst they are absolutely world-class, no question of that, they do tend to be quite expensive and quite cumbersome. And MOD exacerbate that effect by providing exquisite, very, very detailed requirements, which then everybody needs to turn themselves inside out trying to fulfill those requirements. So I think we've got big, expensive companies, very good but expensive. We're not making nearly enough use of the supply chain, which, as Kevin quite rightly said, is very sophisticated. We're probably second in the world in terms of our sophisticated sort of defence supply chain. But yesterday's announcement at number 10 with sort of setting up this SME hub and really pushing hard on setting hard targets for MOD and the primes to use SMEs and mid-tiers much more will most certainly drive down the costs and improve the speed. But the challenge to the MOD is you must get better at providing a problem statement, not an exquisite requirement. And then your contract doesn't need to be 1,000 pages long. Yeah. We've got a little SME called Filtronic, and they've got an 8-page contract from SpaceX. Their MOD contract for exactly the same equipment is 90 pages long. For an SME, that just kills them. So I think we need a change of attitude from the MOD, which we're seeing now, but we need to see that really percolating through the contracts and commercial, and then problem statements, not exquisite requirements, and use the SMEs, use the mid-tiers much more.
Good. Mr. David, is the British taxpayer getting value for money from the defence industry?
I think there's a real challenge in the way that the whole thing works, Chair, and we would sum this up as saying 3 things need to change. So we need to spend faster, and that's a clear thing. If you look at the time from design of anything in a weapons environment or battlefield environment to usage these days, it's weeks. And the British procurement process is years, at least. So that needs to change. And that needs to change for larger as well as smaller and more replaceable units. They need to spend differently. Yeah. At the moment, there needs to be a shift from a hardware-centric, from specifying a project to make this thing that's going to last for 20 years, to make something that might last for 20 years, but design it with a software-centric approach. This is the idea that you actually are able to adapt to requirements by changing the software, by adding things to the platform if it's a big platform, or by actually shipping out replaceable stuff and shipping in the latest version within a software environment. And they need to make sure we have more capacity. So our members are very keen to do more in this space. Many of them already work with larger companies. If you look at the supply chain of larger companies, it's actually got an awful lot of smaller companies in it. But if you want to do something as a single independent SME, then everything in the way things are done makes it difficult, as Andrew has said. In particular, take something as simple as security clearances, which we
will be coming on to that.
Okay, well, maybe I'll stop there then.
Yeah. Obviously, I agree with the comments that you made that the MOD needs to change how it is operating, but also we need to get better at innovating. But Mr. Craven, would you like to come in about?
Yes, 2 points if I may, Chair. So firstly, on the European government's point of view, including the UK, the peace dividend over the last 30 years has meant that the actual spend on defence has reduced by approximately half to 2/3 over that time. So that underinvestment for that time is one of the reasons we're struggling today. In terms of the value for money point, it's directly connected. I would say probably not sufficient value for money is the right answer. The reasons for that are complex and difficult, and they include both the political system, the procurement system, and the capability of the company supplying into that system, are all intimately intertwined when you have a monopoly customer. So it's a difficult balance to get right, and our stop-start nature of our procurement means that we are struggling to produce in the most efficient and effective way.
Yeah, I agree with you there as well, in that we need to increase our efficiency. And I must declare an interest, having started and run my own small business. I agree that SMEs are not getting their rightful share of proceedings, and the obstacles are too much. But I know here that both Mr. Jopp and Mr. Twigg wanted to come in. So Lincoln Jopp first, please.
Mr. Kinniburgh, you used the phrase, "we're not yet on a war footing." And I think we've sort of approached some of the things that might change were we to be on a war footing. I'm just keen to explore the extent to which you have told ministers that you want to be put on a war footing, and whether they understand the implications of that. And in particular, to come back to, I think all three of you have made the point, the MOD needs to get out of the way a bit more. And it's a question of really what they're going to do less of, not what they're going to do more of.
Yeah, I think we're not on a war footing. I think some aspects of the defence supply chain are, but it's few and far between. And I think we have gone, because MOD is very prime focused and tends to focus in on a single supplier for many, many things, including what you would consider fairly basic stuff like ammunition, where there's a single provider. The problem with that is that you just don't have that diversity of supply. So your surge is only one factory, and that factory has a finite capability. So when you go to the war footing, you've only got one place to go, and that's a huge challenge. We wrote to the MOD at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, and we ran a little session with our SME and mid-tier members. We put together a shopping list of what we thought Ukraine might need as they go forward in the conflict. That didn't get a response at all from the MOD. Now, we've moved forward from there, certainly, but we've got many members, MSI Defence, they make naval guns, they make cannons, 30, 40 millimetre cannons. They could be making those now. They could have been making them for the last 3 years with orders from the MOD, but there's no orders. So we're not going to make them, much as we want to support our Ukraine colleagues. You can't make it for nothing. Another company, GW Martin, down on the south coast, make 30 and 40 millimetre ammunition. Again, very few orders for Ukraine or indeed for the UK. And that capacity is there. That factory is actually relatively quiet, and yet there's no orders. So it's deeply frustrating as you go down through the supply chain, because there just isn't that activity. And I'm not having a go at the MOD or the primes.
Go at them as much as you want.
That's why we are here. Don't worry, Mr. Kinniburgh. I mean, before I bring it self in, I think that's precisely what we're here to do. The work of the Defence Committee is the significance of it has enhanced significantly. But if we are not discussing this in this forum, and if people are not stepping up to the plate, then we will fail our country. But I think Mr. Twigg wanted to come in here as well. Derek?
Just a very quick one. I mean, unlike the rest of the question, we're very, very happy to take on the MOD and deal with their shortcomings. But if you might forgive me, it seems to be all the MOD's fault. I just wonder what is it that you could do better? We've heard a little bit about the primes are a bit cumbersome, etc. But what is it that you could be doing better? It's not just about the MOD, is it?
If I may take that, I mean, interestingly, we are technically at a pre-war footing, and a shift is required if we are to improve production capability and capacity. But it's a big step, and I do think that the appointment of the National Armaments Director, which potentially could have the sort of dimensions of a Lord Beaverbrook, a War Minister, around it, is an important step in terms of moving forward. But realistically, in terms of what we're doing, so one of the things I would point to is we are now, as industry, embedded in the plan force testing process and the industry wargamings, which I'm very pleased to say we've been supportive of and helped to bring about. And that is industry being involved in the early force development and capability development processes inside the MOD. So those requirements are better informed. they're better costed, they will produce better outcomes in terms of more value for money for taxpayers. So that early engagement of industry within the walls of the MOD is really important. In terms of, is the MOD solely at fault? Absolutely not. It takes two to tango. In this case, it takes 3 or 4 to tango, frankly. But the system as a whole has to work better together in order that the end production capability is working as efficiently as it possibly could. Yeah. It's a tough question to answer accurately.
Thank you. I want now just to delve further into the UK defence industrial base. Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you. How do we compare to our allies and partners in terms of the depth and scale of our defence industry, and just how important is that industry to the UK as a whole?
Well, if you look at the broader definition of defence, which I think is really important, I would make a comment that in some of these areas, in cyber, in attacking vital communications connections, there is already, you could call it enemy action happening. And it's really important that we understand that and we take the right approach to making ourselves much better cyber secure, looking across the whole of national security. But in terms of how well we're placed, we're extremely well placed in terms of our ability to bring to bear the skills and the capability in that modern context. I've just referenced already the fact that there are over 1 million people employed by the tech industry across the UK, and all of those civilian skills have a bearing on this and can be brought to bear. But, and you come to the but, as Kevin said, it does take two to tango, and I do believe that we've got into a behaviour pattern that does specify exquisite solutions for a problem defined now, but with some idea that it might last longer, instead of us taking things that we know work, that we can see work elsewhere, that we could actually build capacity in the UK to do, and deploying those much more rapidly. But certainly as far as the new modern warfare goes, we are as well placed as anybody.
If I may, I mean, so the UK represents around 20% of Europe's total defence industrial capability in this space, and we are the only country to have put our nuclear deterrent at the service of NATO in the event of a conflict. So we have a really important role to play, which is challenging given the political nature of where we are at the moment. But I would point to some of the other countries where we could learn something. I mean, particularly Germany, where the industrial military complex is very integrated and probably does produce more efficiency in some ways. France, for example, I think we all are aware of their integrated nature of their exports campaigns, and that's important because, and bearing in mind 1/3 of what we do is exported to the rest of the world, that allows us to produce more affordable kit for the UK and also builds allies and relationships around the world. So I do think there's some things we can learn, possibly also point to the Nordics, where whole of society type of defence mindset is something that perhaps we've neglected here in the UK as well. It's been a long time since we've talked about civil defence and societal resilience. I remember the previous Deputy Prime Minister being ridiculed for wind-up radios and things, but there is a point beneath all of that that's important.
If I may, just picking up on Kevin's point about the Nordics, I think Norway is actually quite a good example. I mean, a much smaller nation with a smaller military, but they import about 70 or 80% of their defence equipment, and they have a very forward-leaning offset policy. So they have a legally binding offset policy. So every pound that they spend with an overseas contractor, another pound must be spent in the Norwegian economy. We've, in our defence industrial strategy for Make UK Defence, we've certainly asked for that for the UK. We think it should be something that we consider, and certainly in parallel have a much more UK-focused attitude towards defence equipment. What I was going to say was not so much reflecting on overseas companies, but reflecting on the UK and our ability to attract foreign direct investment. If you look at the number of companies that continue to invest in the UK. We've seen some big Israeli companies, Elbit, Rafael, investing quite heavily recently. Saab have just opened a big campus down in Ferrum, which is a huge, very impressive complex. And then we've got the more established Leonardo's, Thaleses, and others like that. So I think the evidence would suggest that we're actually, and I'm certainly not blaming MOD, Mr. Twigg, just to go back to your previous point, for all of this, but I think the evidence would point to the fact that the UK defence supply chain is very sophisticated. We're a well-regulated and sort of reliable partner, if I'm allowed to use that word, in these slightly scary times, but so that we're seen as a fairly safe place to invest, and with that sophistication, and then if we can bring the tech through as well, then we're in a strong position.
On the tech in particular, what world-leading capabilities do we have in our defence sector in the UK then?
If I may go first, I go back to MSI Defence Systems, world leaders in counter-drone technology, absolutely. Top of the drawer, very, very strong, incredibly capable business. Exports something like 70% of its work, gets few and far between orders from the UK. So it's something like that. Or there are many companies in our supply chain, but I don't want to hog the microphone.
Yeah, to add the tech dimension to that. You see many innovative companies here which are widely used elsewhere in conjunction with defence spend, but also with security spend. And if you look at the sovereign capabilities, national capability here of places like the GCHQ and the other agencies, they are ranked alongside the US, and you've seen that demonstrated in wars. We also saw the UK bring AI into the Joint Expeditionary Force tracking the Russian Shadow Fleet. And that is going to be really important for the future, is harnessing those technologies. They're all here. I would just say, in terms of how to do this better, there really is a problem for new companies and tech companies. The previous to the Defence Industry Joint Council, the Defence Suppliers Forum, actually managed to count 80 plus and more than 80 frameworks in use across the MOD. And we would contend many of them trying to buy similar capabilities and similar things, but with a slight difference because it comes from a different requirement. And the absence of the kind of forward-looking statement to industry that says, we want to build capacity for this, so please invest here, either incoming companies or UK-based companies, because there will be a requirement for that, and we want to have that capacity here in the UK.
I think just adding to that, the actual numbers, so defence exports around 9.5, 10 billion, security exports, which include the cyber and AI type services, is also around 10 billion, a number that's not widely known, so that's really important. But of the defence number, around 70% of that is combat air, so that is quite clearly seen by the global marketplace in terms of a world-leading capability. In Ukraine, the things that they are looking at is some of our drone technologies, some of our AI technologies. Those are being proven on the battlefield as we speak. And, we do have a very innovative and sophisticated supply chain around about. I have 1,300 SME members, and there are some world-leading ones in that.
Thank you very much. I believe Calvin Bailey wanted to come in briefly there as well.
Yes, thank you. So I just kind of want to talk about relationships with the MOD. One of the things that's not come out is how you envisage those relationships with the MOD, and looking at procurement at the MOD, the document, it speaks of strategic partnerships, and under that it lists all the big primes, which clearly one of you represents. What does strategic partnership mean? Because I don't know, and I'd like to.
I'm happy to have a go. So the Strategic Partnering Programme, which is an MOD supplier management programme, has 19 strategic suppliers, all of whom are primes by that definition. And they get a senior responsible officer, they get a commercial officer dedicated to them, and they are designed to help better manage that those partners supply into the MOD. I think it is an improvement on the past. Is it working as well as it could do? Probably not, but it's a step. The challenge on the SME front, and again, just some numbers, the direct procurement of the MOD around SMEs is 4%. There's another 20-odd% that goes via the primes. But 75% of the current spend is with those 19 strategic suppliers, and so managing them is kind of where quite a lot of effort is spent, and one could argue how well that goes.
Right. I think if you look at tech, there are strategic suppliers across the MOD and the broader national security and defence environment. Again, they tend to be larger companies and they tend to be more established. Again, there's a reason why that makes sense and it provides value, because in some cases you need that scale. Where the difficulty comes is building a relationship, if you're a newer supplier or a smaller supplier, directly with the MOD. And, the announcement of the innovation at the SME Hub is a really good step, as long as it becomes a proper place of coordination and a doorway into procurement, as opposed to just another grouping initiative and somewhere else that SMEs have to find a way to navigate to. So I do think the opportunity is there. Again, if they actually, for smaller companies, say, these are the areas where we want to establish reliable long-term partnerships, then you will get those companies starting to invest and you'll get them starting to try and build relationships. But you've got to fix things, Chair. You said about security clearances. It's an obvious one, but it really is difficult for small companies and new companies. Effectively, you have to be in a project before you can be admitted for security clearance, but you can't actually get to know about the project if you don't have it.
Would you say that the strategic partnerships are structural opposition to SMEs?
I'm sorry?
Are the strategic partnerships a structural opposition to SMEs? Should there be a strategic partnership?
No, I don't see that. I think we need both. I do think if you don't have, my colleagues have referenced the fact that you do need large, capable suppliers, and you need to have them to have a relationship where they know what is going to be required for the future, and they can put the capacity and make the investment. These investments take a long time. So I think those exist, and they're good. What I'm saying is we're not doing enough to bring in new types of partners, smaller partners in particularly in the area of tech, but also I think in other areas as referenced. I don't see it as an either-or.
I'm afraid I do. I see it as a barrier. I think there are lots of very well-meaning people in the primes, and I think there's some excellent people. They've got some really high-quality individuals. The system is partly to blame, certainly not all the MOD, as we discussed earlier on. The problem with the Strategic Supplier Programme and the Defence Suppliers Forum, God rest its soul, it's now gone, and we are delighted to see the back of it, frankly, is it's so dominated by the primes. Every cupboard you open in MOD, 5 primes pop their heads out. And that's not to have a go at the primes, because they do a very good job under tricky circumstances. But you cannot reach the parts of the supply chain that you need to. So, for instance, the carriers cannot sail without a tiny little company based down in Southampton that makes the paste that goes in the paint that makes the landing pad on the carriers heat-proof enough to allow that F-35 to land. That tiny little company employs about 7 people. They're not identified as key suppliers. We talked about naval guns earlier on. If you look at something like naval davits, so cranes for delivering small boats into the sea, a company called Welland Lambie in Dudley, fantastic world-leading company. They're on every US Navy capital ship, including the big nuclear carriers. They're on every US Coast Guard cutter. They're on 0 UK Royal Navy ships. They're not on any, because we go to Italy, we go to France, we go to Norway for our things. So the problem is, if you concentrate everything into the strategic suppliers, into the top 19, you tend to drive the behaviours of a little bit of vested interest, but also these companies are under huge pressure to deliver, so they don't always have the resources to go and look out into the UK supply chain. So they may not, some of them may not be aware of these companies because they simply don't have the bandwidth. But the whole structure and why we're excited about this Defence Industrial Joint Council and this SME hub that was launched yesterday is that hopefully it can percolate those relationships right down through the supply chain, and we'll no longer have that slight vested interest or everything seen through a prime lens, which is not always healthy, I don't think.
Right, thank you very much. We now want to move on to the UK Defence Industrial Base, and Ian Room, please.
Yeah. Coming back to what you just said, it'd be interesting how many primes buy out SMEs. And I don't know if there's any figures on actually how many SMEs get bought out to bring them into the prime industry, where they might lose that innovative ideas. So my question would be, obviously the world is moving fast over the last couple of weeks, especially over the last few days here in the United Kingdom. We are European partners. And the government's announced a new defence innovation body, and that's to be moving, in their words, at fast pace to drive reform in defence and use defence as an engine of economic growth. And I know, Julian, you were saying about you're the tech voice in industry, and it's worth a $3 trillion business.
1 trillion.
1 trillion, right? Okay. And I just wondered, innovation within procurement and in industry. Could you just say what is needed? What do we need, and what would you like to see come out of this new unit to create an effective and functioning innovation ecosystem within our defence industry in the United Kingdom?
I think if it really does become the front door and the coordinator of what's going on. So, we've got examples of different parts of the defence environment, the MOD, actually still, looking for the same capability in different places. So the opportunity to coordinate that across the defence and security space and find solutions that smaller companies can bid to, but which are then able to be replicated, you get the benefit of a small player with a new idea, a newcomer to the industry, and the scale to actually do it, which is one of the reasons why primes are so important elsewhere, because of scale. And if that would happen, you notice I'm saying if that would happen, then I think we would have a real opportunity to energise new players coming into the market and get new solutions. The second thing it needs to do is to define things in the here and now. So, you've seen this in many of the battlefields around the world. It's a sad thing to see, but the amount of time that you have between identifying a requirement and actually deploying it is really short. And then it doesn't last. It has to be changed, either upgraded, as I've said, through making it software-centric, or actually replacing it. So getting more used to the idea of churning things within a strategic set of requirements. I think if we do that and we start to act as a single buyer, and we start to think about operational standards and interoperability, I have more to say on that in the context of the international connections, then I think we have a real chance to transform the supply base.
I can take a stab at your numbers point, Ian, but so at the moment, I think the thing to look at is there are these sort of primes or near primes, around 40 odd in the UK, and then there are something like 8,000 or 9,000 direct SMEs below that. In between the sort of mid-tiers, there are very, very few companies, because as soon as they grow up to a certain size, they get acquired. And partially that's because they're being acquired by American venture capital funds or PE funds who get a premium advantage buying US stocks. So the short answer is there's a real dearth of opportunity for those SMEs to grow to the scale to create real competitors. and that is a structural challenge we need to get to. In terms of how do we do it better, the Defence Innovation Unit, I think, is a good thing. I think we really need to understand how that's going to be effected and planned. So it needs a very clear scope of work, very clear plan. We need to understand the interfaces with other bodies like the Defence and Security Accelerator, DASA, DSTL, and the other point. One of the challenges my colleagues have referred to is the number of points of entry into the MOD. It's something like 80 different points of contact for innovation alone. So condensing those into a sensible, manageable amount. Just on the SME points, I kind of want to just... So back to the numbers. The primes, 20% of the MOD spend goes through the primes to SMEs. Incentivising the primes to do more of that, to treat the SMEs better, work with them more closely, would be a massive accelerator in terms of how we do that. Because if you think about the MOD, 4% of their spend goes to SMEs. That's with 2,500, 3,000 commercial officers in existence already, managing the existing number of contracts. So the resources to face off against 8,000 odd SMEs is really going to be quite difficult. So we've got to be clever about using them. I agree absolutely, our SMEs are fantastic and highly valuable to the UK, and they should be engines for growth. So how do we get them to maximise their outputs as well? One big lever would be using the primes to accelerate that.
Do you want to say anything, Andrew?
I would, if I may, please. Yes. I think we would certainly welcome a single portal for innovation. If I give an example of a company that has an innovative solution for Ukraine, they've been to DASA, to the Defence and Security Accelerator. They then got sent to DSTL. DSTL then said, no, not us. Go to Navy X. Went to Navy X. No, not us. TechBridge, which is another Navy innovation unit. Navy, and back to DASA. Didn't get anywhere. It took them a year to go around because there are no front doors for these organisations. Now, I'm exaggerating for effect, but that is the problem. There are no front doors for many of these organisations. So a single unit would be very welcome. And I think a less reliance on retired senior officers, because if there's no front door, then you rely on your retired Air Vice Marshal to give his old pal from Cranwell a ring and knock on the door and go and have a coffee. And I'm being slightly facetious, but I think it's hugely important. If I may just slightly disagree with Kevin on the numbers, the latest MOD figures are 6.8% direct with SMEs, and the primes is 15%. It's dropped by nearly 5%. So it's a declining picture at the moment, and I'm not suggesting that's going to carry on, but we're down to 20% of SME spend on MOD's defence spending rather than 25, which was the original target. We would like to see a much more aggressive target for both the MOD and the primes in going forward.
I'll give you a live scenario here. I've been contacted by a defence company within my area who are quite concerned with some of the procurements that are coming out of MOD for an SME. They employ about 60 people, but they are concerned that they are bidding for contracts and the MOD are saying eight companies have gone for this contract, and 7 have made it through to the next round. But now they're expected to do their own testing. And that testing is going to be somewhere around £300,000. Yeah. Now, for a small SME who previously bidded for these contracts, who the MOD would pay for the testing part, a part of the contract, that would all be in the contract, and now having to fork out this. So I'm thinking, how can we alter things so it's better for these SMEs? Because £300,000 for a small business is quite a lot of mortgages to pay, and I think the MOD need to get better at it. And I'm just wondering, with your expertise, knowledge, what would you sort of be recommending for companies like that? Because your members must come across this all the time.
Yeah, I think I'd use the phrase horses for courses, because what happens is there's a generic approach to procurement which gets deployed across everything and to every company. And if you have 60 people, how many of them do you want in your legal and your financial evaluation and in your response to tenders? It's impossible. The testing point is hugely important. If you're going to bring innovation in from necessarily small companies and things that aren't yet necessarily demonstrated widely, you've got to take responsibility for helping find the solution. The other thing is these contract lengths. I mean, the bidding lengths are just ridiculous. If you're an SME, you work off cash flow, and you cannot spend a year bidding for something, let alone 2 years bidding for something, in the expectation you might win it 1 out of 8. The worst thing is to come second, because you've gone all the way through this process, spent all the money, and you've got nothing. And we don't have a great track record of helping those sort of companies then export that somewhere else. That's something we definitely could learn from other countries, particularly the Americans, but also French and others. They're much more active in promoting their smaller companies when they talk about deals and they talk about exhibitions elsewhere. So there's a whole bunch of things that need to change, Ian, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. I think so testing and evaluation is something that probably could be improved in terms of, combined centres and, there's multiple testing and evaluation centres across the MOD and across the armed forces. There's probably something there, but there are alternatives, for example. So, Ukraine, we've been running trade missions into Ukraine. We had 40 companies in there 2 weeks ago. Their testing and evaluation processes are available, and we've had one company start that process already, and the cost of doing that is significantly below that number you've quoted. So there are possibilities as well in terms of not just thinking about the MOD as a single way through the front door.
Okay. If I may make a bid for they should join a trade association, because parts of our job is to help these companies to navigate through this very complicated system that we have today. I think the key thing for me would be to question where they sit in the supply chain. Are they absolutely certain that they are bidding into MOD, or should they be bidding into BAE, or actually should they be further down the supply chain and really working on a Saab or a Thales perhaps at a sort of subsystem level? So I think it's understanding where you sit in the supply chain is hugely important as well. But we're all here to help if any of them would like to come and see us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Derek Twigg, please.
Could I ask you, what's the greatest challenges to the UK defence industry in terms of resilience and security of supply, in particular in relation to materials and people? And could you say whether that's got worse or better in the last 2 or 3 years?
One thing I would like to introduce into this is digital skills, because increasingly that is going to be a huge part of any defence deployment, any defence capability we have. And that is really not being addressed either in the current MOD and broader British Defence Forces environment, and it's also not being addressed in terms of the reserve either. And we really do think there needs to be a big focus on that. It was very interesting to hear the Prime Minister yesterday talk about the importance of apprentices in what they're planning to do with the new announcement on missiles. That really applies to all sorts of tech, from comms through to battlefield information, through to logistics, through to space, every kind of part of...
So you said the announcement about the significant increase in missiles is going to be a very big challenge for the industry because you just haven't got the people.
Well, he said that they were going to focus on bringing more apprentices in, which will build that capacity.
In terms of what we said about the increase in missiles, are you saying...
It's not happening in tech.
Yeah, okay.
And it's certainly not happening at the scale it needs to, and it could, because as I've said many times, we have a huge tech industry here and a lot of tech capability. But if you look into the MOD, you don't see that matching capacity. You do see it in other areas of security, but not in the MOD.
I assume there are other areas where you have challenges on security of supply and resilience.
Yeah,
There's just one.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I would certainly echo the skills point. So, you know, the workforce shortages and the skills shortages are combining to a point where actually both the defence and the aerospace industry can't fulfil the demand that they have in terms of it. So that is absolutely a barrier to growth. But there's also a challenge around
Let's interrupt you again.
Critical minerals,
Just so we're clear,
yeah.
We get that there's been a challenge. How significant is that in terms of being able to grow quickly? What are we talking about? A year or 2 or 3? You know, what does it actually mean on the ground in practical terms? That's what we're after.
Yeah. So to increase the workforce by 10% it probably requires 2 or 3 years minimum to get to that level. It is a real barrier and a real problem for all of us. I mean, the missiles point is going to require a tripling of production in Belfast where those missiles are being manufactured. And they are probably going to have to run extra night shifts, extra shifts rather than increasing the size and capacity of the factory. That is an option, I understand, as well.
In every member survey that we've done for probably the last 10 years in Make UK and Make UK Defence, skills is the top issue. So not to labour the point, but if I may illustrate a couple of issues. Make UK has a large apprentice training college in Aston and Birmingham. We've got about 300 to 400 apprentices running every year, about 2,000 in the workforce that we assess over the 3 and 4 year apprenticeships. It costs us £35,000 to train one of those apprentices. The apprentice levy will only allow us to receive £27,000. So we lose money on every single apprentice. Now, we're a not-for-profit and we're a reasonably large organisation, so we take the hit. And some of our members that are sending apprentices will also help to pay for that. But it's a huge structural problem. That the other issue we have is that we're in a real the wrong word, an arms race for engineers, because the fintech world, the city, you know, these bright engineers are coming out of Southampton and Bristol and other places, and the city is filled, the streets are paved with gold, and we need to be very clear that we re-establish manufacturing and defence, as Kevin said, actually, you know, rediscover that pride in this sector and what an attractive and fascinating world it is, and well paid. It's not perhaps fintech standards, but it's pretty good and endlessly interesting.
And I think that we were all discussing the fact that there is now, I think, a broader consensus that defence is both important and valuable and something worthwhile, because historically, for example, not just in people going in to participate in the defence industry, either directly with the MOD or in suppliers, versus these other options, green energy, health, etc. But also if finance, we still have a position where the SMEs that we want to grow still don't have the same enthusiasm from the financial services sector to fund their growth plans as other sectors do. And I think the tonal shift from the government is really welcome on that, and we need to do more of that. We have a specific idea for bringing degree apprenticeships focused on defence first. You might know the expression teach first. What about defence first?
So just before I come to the issue about security clearances, you haven't really said anything about materials. What's your take? What's your assessment about the availability of materials that we need to grow this defence industry in the sort of speed that we need? Because we already know there are obviously it's been reported in the press, and we all know, but from your perspective, what is the key challenge in terms of materials?
So again, looking at the tech part of defence, the importance of the hardware components is really strong. So getting the right semiconductors, chips, and having the supply of that, again, a forward-looking view of what you're going to need is essential here. We all remember the point in time at which car manufacturers had to stop production because they could not get chips, because they had viewed the market as declining, and they didn't do forward ordering. Meanwhile, the phones and computer sector was buying all this stuff up. concentration of supply there is also an issue, particularly where most of it happens, which is, as you know, just off the coast of China. So there really does need to be a focus on basics of tech in order for us to be able to put that tech into all the weapon systems that we want to develop. And I would add that very much so. I'd also look at telecommunications and space. You know, there is a good space sector in the UK, but does it have the focus from the defence and security point of view that's needed? Because if it doesn't, then we're going to have problems potentially in the future trying to coordinate a total defence profile.
If I take it from a manufacturing perspective, because Make UK is obviously the voice of British manufacturing and has about 23,000 members overall across the UK in every sector. I think the supply of raw materials is not such a huge issue as it was, post-COVID immediately, but I think there's still inflationary pressures and there's still difficulty in sourcing the right kind of things. I think what the UK needs to get better about as well is using things like UK-made steel where it can. So the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, for instance, the bit that builds the buildings and facilities for UK MOD, has no policy to buy UK steel. So it basically spot buys steel on the open market, which in terms of going back to the resilience issue is a huge thing. If you don't use it, you lose it, as we know. So it's yeah.
Can I just end, just because you touched on it earlier and we get to it, security clearances, how easy it is to get it and what problems is it causing if it's not easy to get? Has it got worse?
It's been, I think, enduring, and credit to colleagues in trade associations, they try and help with that. But there are, I think, several fundamental issues. The amount of time it takes. I mean, if you are looking at a short procurement time and you've got a new solution, which may be somewhere else, but you don't have clearances here, then you have to get those clearances. There's still this concept that if you're not already engaged with us, then we don't have a way to give you a fast path to security clearance. There's also the problem of security clearances in government. We very much see the whole of national security and defence as a single area. As I said, you could argue that in some parts of national security, cybersecurity sector, it is very definitely almost a war footing. There are actions, enemy actions taking place. You cannot get a single security clearance which covers you across the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence, for example. So if there is a solution that's going to be deployed for public safety, national security, which would involve those, perhaps the Foreign Office as well, then you have to go one by one to get the clearances.
Yeah, to help our members, we took the decision 2 or 3 years ago to build our own security clearance unit. So we've gone from roughly managing 200-300 security clearances a year to over 7,000 now, and we are the sort of 5th largest private supplier of security clearances into MOD and the other agencies. And that is really taking some of the process work away from the MOD and doing it ourselves. So there are some answers to it. It can be done. It is a problem, there's no question. But it's...
Is it a serious problem or is it a moderate problem? It's a serious problem in terms of
the length of time to get
hampering our efforts to rearm. Is that right?
Indirectly, yes. Yeah.
It's a big problem for innovation if you think about it, and it reinforces the idea of working with companies you're already working with because they have people who have the clearances.
Right. If I may take a slightly different tack, we have been working with a not-for-profit called the Fair Chance Business Alliance, and they're all about people with a criminal record. And they, at the moment, are automatically disbarred from having security clearance, so they therefore can't play a part in the defence industry. We're desperately short of people, and that is 9 million people in the UK with a criminal record. It's a huge number. If you take something like the welding world, we've got 7,000 vacancies for welders. So what we're trying to do at the moment is work with BAE Systems and the Fair Chance Business Alliance and others and the MOD on a scheme to try and let's see if we can we train some Cat D prisoners in prison in basic welding skills, find them jobs as apprentices in the big defence companies, and then they leave prison straight into a very well-paid job. If you're a nuclear-rated welder, you can be on 70, 80 grand a year. And you don't obviously do that on day one. But what we need to get over is this having a criminal record. Can we somehow get some dispensation, depending on the particular offence, so that we can bring those 9 million people into play? Because it seems crazy not to be able to do that today.
Thank you. Calvin Bailey, I believe you wanted to come in.
Just very directly, Kevin, you mentioned critical minerals and then we drifted past it. So which critical mineral supply chains for defence do you see as critical vulnerabilities for the UK and Europe?
So, and I sit on the DBT's critical minerals group as well. So for the UK, there's probably about 15 odd critical minerals that we consider important to us. And there's a subset of those for defence as well. And Andrew's right, is that the two crises, global crises, COVID and then the Ukraine war, created a massive disruption in those supply chains, and we all realised how vulnerable those critical mineral supplies were. It has got better. It isn't necessarily a factor in production, but if, for example, China chose to clamp down on its control both of the refining and the mining of those critical minerals, they are the global leader in about 13 or something like that of the 15. It would be a serious problem, and we would see the results here almost immediately.
Thank you. Mr. Craven, if you can please just write to the committee formally about a list
Happy to do that.
on that would be most helpful, just for the record. Right, I want to bring in Alex Baker, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Okay, let's talk about a few more of the challenges for our defence industrial base. So, firstly, access to finance and funding. What are the challenges for the industry in relation to their ability to obtain investment and capital?
I'm happy to go first. So look, for probably the last 6 or 7 years, realistically, the trend towards ESG principles being used in investment has meant that defence has probably not been considered favourably by investment managers, and the changes in taxonomy, EU legislation, etc., has accelerated that. Fortunately, the war in Ukraine has reversed some of that sentiment, but we still have a number of issues, particularly for our SMEs, who are struggling with access to finance. And that's not just investment, it's cash flow support, it's in some cases personal bank accounts, it is landlords refusing to rent to defence-focused companies. There's a litany of these things that's around. It is an improving situation because I think both politicians like yourselves and certain investors have changed their approach and considering it, but we're still challenged, particularly at the smaller end of the spectrum.
I would add to that, the nature of defence development tends to be long-term, and often if you're an innovator, there isn't a big market yet. So you need patient capital to develop this stuff. That applies pretty much across the sector and into the broader cybersecurity space. And our members universally tell us that they end up often going to the US and maybe other places to get investment. Used to be a lot of connection with China. That's obviously something that has a distinct issue from a security point of view. So really we need to change the way that these funds are looked at. It's very interesting, some of the government hosted funds, and I was really interested to see the latest announcement, are now saying defence is a very valid and important area for us to invest in. And that, I think, has the potential to transform the ability of, we talked earlier about the problem of mid-sized UK companies growing before they end up getting taken over. Obviously, if they have primary sources of funding when they are in the early stages are from the US, then the likelihood that they will eventually end up there is quite high.
We surveyed our members at Christmas time in readiness for a round table with the business secretary, and the result we got back was 11% of our members had experienced problems with financial services broadly speaking, and that's being debanked, can't get insurance, as Kevin said, you know, rent difficulties, all sorts of things like that. So if you extrapolate that across the whole of the defence industry, you're probably heading for about 1,000 companies, which is a very significant number. But I think what we're all struggling with, and we've all looked at this, you know, collectively and separately, is there doesn't, forgive me for the analogy, there doesn't seem to be a smoking gun. There isn't one obvious thing that has led to this situation. I think part of the problem is the longevity of contracts, and back to Mr. Room in terms of your test and evaluation. If your constituency company had a 10-year contract, well, actually, maybe that 300,000 would become a feasible investment. And I think a lot of the banks are looking at that longevity and the kind of lumpiness of the defence market as it is today, which hopefully will get solved when the defence industrial strategy kicks in and looks at certainty and sort of surety of contract. So I think the banks are hesitant, partly because we're defence, but partly because we don't have those long-term contracts. We asked another of our members who's in the automotive industry within Make UK. They had 90 companies within their supply chain that had been debanked in the last year, so just had their banking withdrawn. And so there's an element of shaky balance sheets and sort of weak P&L as well as all the other things, but it's multifactorial, I think we could say.
Right. That's really good. I'm really keen to bring this to life, and it's great to hear a case study of, you know, actually that defence company. I was actually going to ask, as a follow-up, you know, what examples have you got amongst your members of, you know, what this actually means? What is their lived experience of this?
So what happens is when they encounter that kind of issue, and there are other issues as well that affect small companies. So the HMRC investigation into tax credits, for example, picked up problems, but it also for about a year stopped legitimate funds being used, or companies being able to say, we definitely have that money and don't have to pay it back. At which point, if you're a very early stage company, then your other investors say, well, do you have that money or don't you? So at least you get a hiatus. And that happens in every area of the investment cycle. I think the points about, you know, where should you be putting a company, which was made earlier by Andrew, again, nobody until recently has been looking at defence in the UK as a surefire place to build an innovative new set of solutions, whereas they do look at that for some of our other industries such as finance, health and green tech. So again, I think recent announcements and the change of dialogue could really be helpful here, but it does need real focus and turbocharging, and we do need to understand blockages and stop them.
Kevin, have you got an example of one of your members? Could you tell us their story?
Yes, and look, we should say that a number of members are a little bit reluctant to step into the public limelight. You know, the example of sort of Nigel Farage being debanked as writ large in their minds in terms of losing their only access to finance in the middle of their own cash flow crisis. So we have approximately, in terms of numbers, we surveyed about 5,000 companies, of which 200 odd had a problem with access to finance issues, and particular one was where the principal was refused a personal bank account, and in actual fact his personal bank account was taken away from him because of the connection with the defence company, and that extended to then a short-term loan that they had, which was not extended, and ultimately they ended up with almost going bust because of that lack of finance. And that's repeated quite consistently. I do think there are solutions, by the way. There are some structural things we can do. So, for example, in the roundtables we held with both the Investment Association and the techUK, things like the MOD's NDA clauses in their contracts actually prevent those companies sharing some of the details of those contracts in order to gain finance, and really important to do that. So there is, I think a few things. One, the political leadership on this, calling upon these institutions to pay more attention to it. MOD thinking about how they contract, and the trade association supporting their members in trying to navigate some of these application systems and processes which are pretty onerous. One of the results of COVID was that the banks have taken people out the loop and are now using algorithms and systems to process applications. So any special circumstances, if you're a defence company, kind of get an automatic cross against them. So there's things we can do, but it takes a collective effort from all of us to make it happen.
So for example, one of the things is just change the way the dialogue's happening. In tech, you probably all spotted that we have a habit of taking any other industry, shortening its name and sticking tech on the end. So you get fintech and biotech and green tech and clean tech and so on. And we have just at techUK started a defence tech, which may get shortened. But the idea there is to say this is a legitimate sector for innovators, for new companies to come and participate in, and there will be markets for what you're producing, because that obviously is very important for the investors. But it's really about trying to change that dialogue so that this is no longer a sort of hidden secret that you're working with the MOD. It's actually something to be proud of.
May I just give another very quick example? Not a company, but a growing concern from our members who are involved in the internal combustion engine sector, because you're not going to move a tank using batteries anytime soon, and if you are, you probably have 6 tanks behind it full of batteries to try and move it even a few meters. So the military vehicles will remain, certainly the heavy ones, the armoured ones, will remain internal combustion driven for quite a few years moving forward. I mean, the MOD is testing sort of diesel hybrid type battery power for utility vehicles, but armoured vehicles not going to happen. What we're hearing from the banks is that if you have any kind of alliance with the internal combustion engine, they're holding their hands up and going, whoa, not happy about that. We can't see a future in that. So I think we need to be very careful in defence not to get sort of painted with the same brush as the sort of civilian automotive market, which is electrifying obviously at breakneck speed. We simply can't do that in the defence industry, so perhaps there needs to be some sort of caveat to the banking industry to say, look, if you're in defence and it's internal combustion, perhaps there's a caveat that enables them to continue to be banked.
Thank you, that is really useful. And I know lots of people, in recent years have talked about the need to change some of these rules, but it feels to me like, given, even what has happened in the last week, the time is now, and I'm coordinating a group of over 60 Labour parliamentarians who, are working to call on the financial industry to actually change some of these rules and actually see if we can actually make this easier for the industry. So I secondly just want to come on and talk about export challenges. To make our defence ecosystem sustainable, we need a thriving export market. What are the challenges in relation to the attractiveness of UK companies to foreign buyers?
I think visibility and presence is the biggest thing, particularly for the SMEs and newer companies. And I do think that we don't really see a coordinated approach to bring those kind of companies into discussions that we have with overseas markets. And I'm not even sure there's a clear pattern within DBT about which are the markets that we want to promote these to. Clearly there are issues about the kind of country that we want to export defence materials to, dual-use materials equally. But there are many that we're very happy to do that with, and I don't think we're as present and visible with our SME base and our innovators as we could be. I don't know, Kevin, I think there's more capability in the larger companies, some of which they do themselves, don't they?
They do. I mean, look, and defence primarily, the customers are governments. So a government-to-government framework is the starting point for most levels of procurement. I agree with Julian's point around the awareness and visibility of UK companies, and in recent years, the support for smaller companies exhibiting at trade fairs and on trade missions has fallen away, which has created a problem. There are still possibilities around that, but I'd also point to just some challenges and things like processes on the export control licenses. At the moment, whilst the export control joint unit is actually working quite well, some of the other departments they interface with, like FCDO, MOD, Home Office, etc., their advisory on whether to grant those licenses don't have, for example, a KPI in terms of how quickly they need to respond. So improving processes, improving visibility, a bit more support to our smaller firms around how we do that, and then we do need to resource the government-to-government frameworks. That is a real challenge for us at the moment, and where people like the French are a long way ahead of us.
I think we also need to address things like the European Defence Agency, which has a mission to actually coordinate procurement across EU countries, and being able to participate in that is really significant for all sizes of UK defence companies. And things like the Diana initiative and NATO, again, it always seems as if we're slightly outside some of these international initiatives rather than what we think we could be in a leading role with them.
Thank you.
If I may, I think we need to step back a step from there. We need to start buying from the UK. The UK MOD needs to prioritise buying British and buying from the UK, and because that's step one in export primary school. Is the first question any overseas buyer will say is, are you being used in the home market? If you're not, it makes it doubly difficult then to go forward and win that work. And we've incredibly capable exporter in the UK, incredibly capable. We surveyed our members, and 50% of the SMEs in our membership export. So 50%, half of them are exporting. 75% of that 50% are exporting to the EU, which actually surprised us quite a bit, but it's big exporters to the EU. So we are part of that European supply chain. But we give very little support to our exporters. I think we have UK Defence and Security Exports, UK DSE, part of DBT. They do a pretty good job under very trying circumstances, i.e. a tiny and shrinking budget. But you look at somewhere like Australia, you rock up to Space Air Power in Washington. There's a huge Australia stand the size of this room with a kind of moving display above it saying Australia and barista coffee. And you've probably got 30 SMEs on that stand. It's free for Australian SMEs to exhibit at that show in Washington. Get yourselves there, bring your kit, we'll do everything else. And we look at that jealously, I think, from the UK. We just simply don't have anything like that. We used to have a small support programme for companies, and that's gone as well. So there's very little support for SMEs. But I think we've got to buy British. If I may just, Kevin mentioned the export control joint unit as well. We're seeing some real problems in the dual use world. So one of our members is Oxford Instruments, who make a lot of scientific instruments. They're getting trapped in that hinterland of dual use. And it's just a blanket no for a lot of their work. And they're one of the leading companies in the world in what they do. But everything's being refused because it's being sold to China, in many cases not for military use, in fact in all cases, but it's getting caught in the system. So we think there needs to be some work on that to help our exporters.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Jesse Norman, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming in. I'm sorry I joined late. You talked earlier about bright engineers and degree apprenticeships. I should declare an interest because I'm very much involved with our new Model Institute Technical University in Hereford. And just to say, there is a route which is a 3-year accelerated master's, which gets you into that space much more quickly and with tremendous support from companies. So I just flag that as an alternative because I think that is a route for the country as well as for Herefordshire. And this actually relates to it, which is reserves, how you build more capacity. And of course, I also want to think about people who might come back into service as reserves, but also people who might come through perhaps technical universities or other university OTCs into the reserves and then potentially into officer training, or indeed as an enlisted service person. Could you just talk a little bit about where you see that, how that fits into the picture from a defence industrial standpoint?
If I may take that, first of all, as a former junior under officer at the universities of the City of Edinburgh University's Officers Training Corps, I peaked very early in my military career. I think it's hugely important that the reserves are. I think what we haven't done yet, and it's again going back to this wartime footing, is we haven't got reserves in industry that are ready to go. And I mean, they're ready to go militarily, but we don't have industrial capacity reserves either. So I think it's hugely important. One of the companies I mentioned earlier, MSI Systems, has 40 veterans and reserves out of a workforce of 200. So they've got drone operators who've just come out of the Royal Marines, and they're operating drones for their testing of their artillery, but they're ready and waiting to come back in. I think Admiral Phil Halley has been working on the zigzag career idea where you move in and out seamlessly from military to industry, perhaps to the civil service, back into military. I think we'd like to see that develop much more aggressively and give us that much bigger pool of resource.
Okay, thank you. Before we come on to the other two gentlemen, you raised at least three interesting points there. One is we're shockingly bad at this compared, for example, to the Americans or indeed the French, where you can just run in and out of the administrative, political, defence, commercial world with, it seems, much greater ease. The second is, obviously the example you've chosen is a quasi-military business which is drawing on people who've come out of service. But isn't there a much wider issue, which is the use of reserves and the support for reserves across the whole of our industry, including the financial sector and other places like that, where we could have those people? And the third point, which I think comes out of what you're saying briefly, is, historically it was always the case that there was an awareness of potential dual use in industry as regards defence. That's dropped out of the picture in the last 30 years. Even more so, oddly enough, in America. It tries to make tanks, it doesn't anymore, I don't think. What can we do on those three, just as a little provocation perhaps for you, Julian?
So I think a number of things that are important here, one of which is we've actually got to have the concept of being a producer of digital talent with an interest in defence and the broader defence space. And there are plenty of examples around the world of people actually taking people in and training them. We used to do this. I mean, the Royal Signals back in the day was a great source of talent for the burgeoning early tech and telecommunications industry. And we just don't paint those pictures of you will get trained here, and the way to do it, I think, absolutely is degree apprenticeships, and flexibility around that and concentration around that. Why not have particular universities? One of the things that struck me many years ago was seeing there are particular universities that have a very large cohort of nurses. There don't seem to be any approach like that says, near and Hereford's an interesting placing point, near a place where there is strong defence capability. Why not have that as a place where people can learn and earn and get a view of defence? So you just build the capacity. There are other countries that do this particularly effectively, and people want to do this because they see this as a way to get their training and to get their
career
experience,
pathways, if you like, narrative,
which is broader because it's an industry standard set of qualification that they can then take if they wanted a fintech or whatever. But we now know they have a defence mindset, and we should know who they are. Yeah. So all of a sudden we've got a much broader community to talk to about being in the reserves. I think the second thing that does need to happen is we need to make it much more interesting and attractive for people in companies to participate in a reserve workforce. And I think that's a bigger and more challenging question because of everything we've talked about, which is, the perception of defence, not a great thing. Clearly wrong. But
we like it in Herefordshire, I can tell you.
I'm afraid that it's, it's changing in tech. There were a lot of tech companies where people said, we're not going to work on defence-oriented activities. That's changed. It's particularly changed in America. And it's changed in two ways. The existing tech companies are now embracing working in defence, but also people from those companies are setting up defence-oriented companies, many of whom are coming into the UK to try and help with our defence here. So I would say that's the bigger challenge.
I do think your societal point around is an important one, and actually I was in Helsinki a couple of weeks ago at a defence exhibition, and their comprehensive security and defence concept, total defence in society, is amazing. And my taxi driver, I asked him, had he done his reserve service, and he had done 6 months working in a medical capacity as a hospital porter or something, and he said it was life-changing for him. Yes. So I genuinely believe we've got to do something about it. We started a few years ago with the National Citizen Services concept, which was sort of a 2-week experience for young students. Was sort of a nod to it, but just doesn't encompass what we need. Because, I mean, if you look at back to defence, 25,000 reserves, you know, it's not in a great state. And really, to mobilise them in the event of war would be a very difficult thing to make a useful difference to us. We have to think about it more, and I really think the idea of it working across society is a good thing.
Thank you. And with your permission, just a supplementary to that, really helpful contributions from all of you. Thank you. So there's a problem of scale, just raw shortage of numbers. Is there also a problem of skills and capabilities that we'd like to be reaching into in terms of reserves?
Very much so. The industry reserve that Andrew referred to is in that line. You know, we are consistently, as I said earlier, very short on technical and engineering skills and workforce. So building that workforce over time through either apprentices or graduate entry or taking people mid-career, desperately important, because there are real jobs here. They pay 40% more than the national average, and you know, we have multi-generational job families in places like Barrow or in Herefordshire and what have you, where it's embedded in the system and in society. So it's really important.
Thank you. Any good? Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Lincoln Job, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to do a contact battle question, if I may. So, obviously, America has said that they're no longer going to be supporting Ukraine with military support. In the UK sovereign capabilities, where are we not able to fulfill any of the roles currently being filled by the Americans? And I mean, the obvious ones are sort of Patriot, ATACMS and HIMARS, but is there anything else that we don't have nationally that we couldn't, you know, bring up to scale in order to fill that gap?
So I would go with communications and information, surveillance and reconnaissance capability. You know, everybody talks about Starlink, but it's a broader problem than that. And that really does need thinking about, even at the level of GPS. You know, again, famous incident where a previous Defence Secretary's aircraft was no longer able to connect to the GPS, which is essential for safe operation. So I do think that's a really strong area. And it's interesting because we do have a lot of defence and telecoms capability, but I'm not sure we've understood just how significant being able to manage that independently may turn out to be.
The one I would highlight is electronic warfare. We've got a great capability in the UK and we haven't used it. We've outsourced it. We've bought from America and from other nations, and that is a sovereign capability we still have, but we're not buying it from the UK. So therefore, as you understand better than anyone, sovereign capability equals freedom of action. So the risk we have at the moment is fast jets, the whole fast jet fleet in the UK, their ability to operate independent of other nations is potentially at risk because we've outsourced our electronic warfare.
I would say mass, so munitions is probably the biggest critical area. So when the Ukraine war started, we commissioned one factory for 155mm ammo. Americans opened 6 factories at the same time. So that is a real problem, an immediate life-threatening existential problem for Ukraine is ammunitions. And just the size of it is, the whole of Europe is roughly equivalent to the US support. So essentially means all of us in Europe, if we were able to do it together, doubling our defence outputs in terms of supplying Ukraine, that's a big ask.
Okay, thank you. That's enlightening and somewhat worrying.
One additional comment on that is there is going to be a need still to coordinate, collaborate with international partners. One of the things that is important for us to do, though, with respect to having freedom of action, is to get standards set so that whatever we are using on an international basis has interoperability standards set, so there can be therefore multiple sources of doing that. At the moment, there's too many silos of the only place you can get that all the way down throughout the supply chain is this one source, and if that source says no, then you're stuck. But if you had more standards in this space, particularly across the tech space, then you can chop and change and you can interchange things.
I mean, we did have the NATO standard, and at the end of the Cold War, the only two things that were common across all NATO members were diesel and 105mm ammunition.
Yeah.
So, and that was at the end of the Cold War. So, good luck, is what I'd say to that.
Well,
you all put in your submissions to the Defence Industrial Strategy by last Friday's deadline. Without wishing you to regurgitate, I'm sure, wonderful prose, can you just pick your one thing that you want to see out of the Defence Industrial Strategy?
Well, the one that I would have picked before yesterday was a small business office within the MOD, and I think we've got that with the SME Hub. So we need to see that implemented now. But to back that up, we need hard, regulated percentage spend on SMEs for the MOD and the primes, and no wriggling out of it. And that SME Hub needs to make sure it polices the supply chain and make sure and holds the MOD and the primes to account in that percentage spend. So we want to see much more like the DoD model, where it's 25% of DoD spend direct with SMEs, and for the primes it's 30% of their spend must be with SMEs. So that would be my ask. Thank you.
So I would, out of all the things that we've said, I would think the most important thing is to spend differently. We're going to spend a lot more money, but we do need to spend it differently. So I've used the expression horses for courses. We've got to understand, in a general view of capability that we need, how do you procure some of those things differently? And also this idea of moving away from a sort of project or asset-based acquisition into a long-term capability, thinking about processes. We call it software-centric. So think about how you can adapt and change things. And lastly, stop specifying to the nth degree what you think you're going to need in 20 years' time.
I would actually just ask for one thing, is effective implementation. So DCIS a few years ago actually had some very sensible suggestions, and the majority of them were not implemented. So actually an industrial strategy that we carry out and follow with rigour would be game-changing, frankly.
Which is probably where this committee can play a role.
I believe it can, absolutely can.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. So now we want to, I know, Mr. David, you touched upon it earlier as well, that we want to now look at the UK defence partnerships with allies further beyond. So shall we get a start with Kelvin Bailey, please?
Okay, thanks very much. Firstly, Julian, your discussion about Defence Industrial Strategy and the need to combine reserves with STEM is pretty much speaking to my industrial strategy submission, so I'll send it to all three of you, and I look forward to you championing it, because that's literally what I wrote. NATO then, and I've just heard from Mr. Jopp how NATO has struggled in the past to cohere, aggregate capacity. We've seen that NATO Defence Production Action plan promises urgent and meaningful action to aggregate demand, address supply chain challenges and increase standardisation and interoperability, primarily in munitions and weapons. And further, that the NATO industrial capacity expansion pledges to commit to allies to growing defence industrial capacity production, reducing barriers between allies, greater coordination of industrial planning, and increased multinational procurement. Now, we've heard that at the end of the Cold War, we only really had 2 areas which were effectively standardised. With that all at mind, what is NATO's role in UK defence industrial base?
Could I take that first and give you an example? I think it's probably, for me, from my simple mind, it's easier to give an example of how NATO could play an incredibly powerful role. Fast jet training at the moment is in crisis in the UK and probably more broadly across Europe. And the UK MOD just alone is spending £50 million a year on outsourcing fast jet pilot training, which just beggars belief. We're sending dozens of pilots over to the US and to Italy and other places to train our fast jet pilots because there is no availability for Hawk jets at RAF Valley. So we are in crisis in the UK. So are many other countries in Europe, and they're all thinking, what are we going to do? And we get all the arguments from the RAF and others, it'll synthetic training, that'll do it, that's fine, just hop out of your little, your turboprop aircraft and here's your F-35 keys, off you go, crack on. I'm being slightly facetious again. But that would be a classic example of where NATO could really generate incredible cost savings, economies of scale. There's a company in the UK called Iralis, and they've redesigned the whole concept of a fast jet trainer, an advanced jet trainer, UK-based business, UK design and manufacture. That's the kind of thing NATO could say, right, we're going to provide a NATO-wide resource for fast jet training. We're going to use the same jet right across it. UK can step up from an industrial perspective with the MOD's backing, and then we can establish an entire fleet of fast jet trainers that can be used across NATO. The RAF don't need to own them, nor do any other countries. They can simply contract for availability. So there's not that big capital expenditure. There's not the worries about maintenance, repair and overhaul, which is the big challenge at the moment with Hawk. So for me, NATO could really play a huge part in something like that, a big enabler that almost fixes the fast jet pilot challenge that we have today quite quickly within 3 or 4 years.
Andrew, thank you. That speaks perhaps to the colossal mistake that we made with Hawk and our failure to actually look forward into GCAP and understand that there was a gap there and to have ceded leadership ourselves. Julian, is there anything?
I think NATO has shown itself to be hugely important. There's more collaboration within NATO perhaps than is visible across the whole piece. There are individual country alliances, and obviously the collaboration between the UK and the US has been outstanding. So I think what we need here is a really challenging approach that says this problem must be addressed in terms of us actually actively working together, whether it be in something specialised like fast jet training, whether it be in setting interoperability standards more broadly. Ammunitions obviously was an obvious one, but there's so many other places where you could have standards. Maybe we have to embrace the concept, which again the Prime Minister talked about, of the willing partners. If NATO operates on collaboration and cooperation at the pace of the slowest the slowest participant, then we're going to repeat what's happened up to now. Whereas if we take, for example, the very encouraging words coming out of the new potential German Chancellor and things that President Macron is saying, and actually say, well, let's work with them, let's work with Poland, let's work with people that understand the scale of this, and then actually try to get to a point where we are not just doing a different version of each of these things within the country, but we're actually thinking about this on a more coordinated basis. And I also think that means bringing in the European Defence Agency not letting them go a different path, but actually emphasising the point that you need a broader than EU approach to this, so you do need to bring in countries around the periphery. So I would say don't give up on it. I mean, one of the surest ways to produce the outcome we don't want is to actually talk as if it is the case. I'm sure President Macron is wondering about that, given the statements he made a few years ago.
Thank you.
You mentioned DPAP. I mean, there are three elements to DPAP: aggregating demand, addressing defence industrial challenges, increasing interoperability. And actually, I think Julian mentioned it, the aggregating demand is an interesting one. So some of these platforms we're talking about in defence are billions and trillions of pounds and dollars in terms of producing them, and single nations find it increasingly difficult to fund those. So cooperation on producing major platforms is probably a sensible way forward. There's a good example available with combat air, for example. So we have Global Combat Air, French and the Europeans have FCAS. You know, there is the possibility with things like loyal wingmen drones, munitions, propulsion systems, where multiple countries could act together and could be procured together through NATO to produce a better result for all of us. And we've done that in the past. We can do it again in the future. So for me, one of the things we need to do is really accelerate the Defence and Security Pact with Europe. I think the NATO question is, in a sense, a subset of that, particularly given the circumstances that we're seeing today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Martin, please.
Actually, if I could just explore that a bit further, actually. Ideally, you want your defence industrial planning to match the geopolitics of what's going on. And I understand you guys can't comment on the geopolitics, but let's just take as an assumption that one of the paths in the future might be that the Europeans, of which I include the UK, do collective defence on their own without the Americans. And one of the key enablers of that really would be a unified defence industrial base across Europe. Now, I wonder if I might just ask you all to hypothesise what that might look like. And you've spoken, Julian, about interoperability. Actually, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but you've almost spoken about a kind of open architecture where you can plug and play stuff into it. Is it through current structures? Is it a new structure? Is it an adjunct to the treaty organisation that provides that collective defence? RIF, guys. What do you think it should look like?
I'm not sure you can go from where we are to unified very easily, but I think you could do a lot more on coordinated. I also think that there are bilateral and trilateral opportunities that address a large part of the capacity of NATO and the capacity of any European capability. And I think those things can be built, and I think they can be built around a frank understanding that for an awful lot of defence forces, there isn't the capacity for it to happen just in one country. So, for example, if you look at our aircraft carriers, much better if those are part of an international approach, so that you can have other ships, you can have all of the other things that you might want. You're going to do that across NATO. I would start by doing it with the obvious people, and we have to some extent seen that obviously with the Americans, but with the French as well. And we have some of these ideas. So take the concepts that say, we're going to need this kind of thing. Can we, as 3, 4, 5 countries within the NATO umbrella, actually agree to coordinate what we do there? Unified, I think, is a little way away.
Okay. Evan?
I agree it's a little way away, but on the other hand, if we look at aerospace and the very integrated supply chains across the UK and the EU, it is entirely possible to have that, and we do in the civil aircraft structures, so we can do so in defence as well. And I think some really powerful examples of it exist. Small way, so the Trinity House Agreement, in Asia Pacific AUKUS, but we, for example, have been working with our fellow trade associations in Europe, so a year-long program with GFAS in terms of suggesting some possibilities for working on in the forthcoming Lancaster House 15th anniversary agreement. There's a couple of programs, including, actually, interesting enough, the Jet Trainer program that Andrew referred to was one of those suggestions. So, and we're doing the same thing with BDLI in Germany. I do think building these industrial bridges between the countries, and actually political bridges. I mean, this committee could interact with counterparts in Europe, and that building of a mindset and an understanding will assist with building the sort of allowing us into the EU defence programmes. So EDIS, EDIP, all of these things, we're effectively barred from. That is not a great starting place, and we've probably got to address that in order to move forward towards a slightly more unified future.
Just before I come to you, Andrew, what I'm hearing is a series of mini-lateral relationships that sort of build us to where we want to get to. But it's a bit of a nonsense, really, isn't it, that Europe, every single country has a different rifle or a different tank or infantry fighting vehicle, or it's inefficient is the politest way I can put it. And so, how do we get to a point where Europe, in a multipolar world, Europe needs to build unified military power to stop itself being coerced. And in order to build unified military power, you need to have one rifle, that's a kind of fundamental keystone of that. So how do we actually I know you said, basically what you said politely was that's a bit pie in the sky, Mike, but it needs must, right?
Sorry, it came across
No,
that way.
it's absolutely fine. Needs must.
Yeah.
So what would that look like?
Well, I think one of the things, and Andrew, I slightly disagree with you on this, is in order to do this, you have to have a broader mindset than Buy British. You actually have to think about capacity in the UK, which is both indigenous but also involves partner countries and their industries investing here. Because if we take a simple slogan, then that's basically where we've been. But we buy British, maybe they certainly buy French, they certainly buy German, etc. So I do think that the basic thing has to be confronted is, can you actually get trust and can you get cooperation to the level of saying, well, we're either each going to participate in building something we all use, or we're actually going to trust what you produce, and we're going to use that across as many interested and willing partners as possible. What I would say is that you do always need freedom of action preserved there. Some of the agreements we've done in the past have meant that another country's government has been able to say, you can't use that for this. So we need to have a freedom of action. We also need to have, and I'm sorry to come back to it again, the option of interoperable stuff, so that if that thing has only got supply of spare parts or maintenance capability from one place, that's not a good.
Hence standardised kit, right? And then your training idea, then everyone's training on the same equipment.
Yes.
So if Italy needs 100 vehicles, well, we can just take them from anyone.
I'm going to make myself unpopular here in terms of saying it probably takes an act of political will from one of the three biggest countries in Europe, including ourselves, to make that determination that we will either share or we will use someone else's kit, because someone has to go first. And it is possible. So, 155mm shells we talked about. At the start of the Ukraine war, there was 13 variants around Europe. Ludicrous, same as main battle tanks, but there's only 3 now apparently. So it's reduced. So there's a trend and an understanding of that we can move forward, and that kind of goes to the standards point, kind of goes to the interoperability point in a less complex way. But it is political will because nobody wants to say, I'm using French rifles.
Why not?
Forgive me.
Yeah, and I think there's a moment for political actors to seize, which is, everybody's getting the idea they've got to spend a lot more and they've got to get more capability. They're not going to be able to do that from their own resources in the short term. Everybody talks about the fact that the European economy, the EU plus adjacent countries, is much bigger than the Russian one. But the Russians have a single focus and a single approach to this. And if you then take that approach into 28, 29, 30 countries...
Yes, exactly. There's 500 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans to defend them from 140 million Russians. It's nonsense. Yeah. Andrew?
I think, if I may, I'll give you a bad example, I think, which is the Global Combat Aircraft Programme, the GCAP. Not that it's not a good programme, but why are we competing with France and Germany to build a European sixth-generation jet? Why? It's madness, and we need to look at something like that as an example of where it's absolutely blindingly obvious, perhaps to my naive eyes, that we collaborate. We bring together those three major powers in European defence and work together along with Italy and others. So I think that's an example of where we should be collaborating. And I do agree with you, Julian. We, yes, buy British, but it needs to be in a sensible way. And we can't all make all things, and that's tended to be what's happened before, where every country says, well, I want to build the armoured vehicle, I want to build the rifle, I want to...
So you almost need a kind of Soviet Union-style agreement where you say, you guys are going to build the tractors, you guys are going to build the light utility vehicles, you guys are going to build the... For example...
Yeah, to some extent, and I think if you look at the German armoured vehicle programmes now that the UK is running, you could almost say we're beginning to move towards that. We've effectively outsourced our design and development of armoured vehicles to Germany. Yeah. But where's the quid pro quo? That would be the important bit. The good example is MBDA, the missile maker. They've got research and development and production facilities in multiple European countries. And I think probably they would say it's not perfect, but it's a really good model where you've got specialisms in each country, you've got capabilities to build in each country, and it's a much more coordinated view of that European landscape than many programs.
I would use a US rather than Soviet, because if you think the US is a federal system, and the states compete for these kind of things, particularly government contracts, and they manage that in a way that still lends itself to them having unified equipment.
It's a much better analogy. Thank you very much. And Chair, if I could just have one final, something that you said about access to EU defence structures. Okay, fine. But if we're going to do much closer procurement, joint procurement, unified procurement, whatever it is, actually there's a problem if we're outside the single market, because we constitute, by your figures, 22% of the European defence market. And if we've got stuff that's flagged as military or part of those defence supply chains, you've got to have porosity in the single market, surely, so that stuff can move quickly. I mean, in a crisis, you don't want to be filling in paperwork to move stuff across borders. So do you each briefly like to comment on how we bridge this gap in terms of defence procurement, where the biggest defence market sits outside the EU single market?
Can I tackle that first? Because I think there's a good example of where we've done that without having to have that kind of geopolitical jointery, if you like. That's a horrible word, isn't it? And it's AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US. We're seeing all sorts of things. Movement of people, so you can have a visa which will allow people on the AUKUS programme to move freely between the three countries. We've got dispensation for export licences, and we've got dispensation for technology agreements and technology transfers. So that's quite a good example of where three quite different nations, to some extent, in terms of their procurement, their geopolitics and the rest, can operate together. And it's taken a hell of a lot of work, and the MOD and other government departments have worked incredibly hard, along with the trade associations who've been intimately involved in it as well. But that would be a good example of where we don't have a single market, but we've created special dispensations in the areas that we need to let things move fairly freely. It's not quite running at full tilt yet, but hopefully, if it survives with President Trump, then it will be a good example of where we might be able to build that kind of relationship.
We do need that in Europe. It's
Definitely
effectively what you're saying. That's an essential precursor to. Yeah. Anyone else like to add on to that? Or
I think it is about. It's as trade association, it's not my job to determine the democratic will of the British people. That's something I leave to you. But what is clear is that there are imperatives that, as you say, need to be addressed. And I do think there is the opportunity to build those kind of links better and to actually address that. Because, again, I will repeat the point about the new German Chancellor to be new German Chancellor, said straight away in his acceptance speech, we must build a closer relationship with the UK as well as with France. So the answer to that is then sort these things out. So professional skills recognition, movement of people, much faster and smoother supply chains. The horizon, research and development collaboration, that's something the UK is back in. There are a number of areas where we could do a lot better job and start by building on the things that are being said by major economies in the EU.
helpful.
Yeah. I would point to Lancaster House, treaty with the French 2010. Complex weapons came out of that. MBDA working on that in multiple countries, as mentioned. There's also a nuclear element to that conversation. We work and we do testing in combination with France in a French facility. So there's, it is entirely possible. Tank barrels with Rheinmetall and so on and so forth. It is possible. We just have to scale that up to convince the wider European partners that this is the only way forward where we are genuinely looking at existential threats for some of our European partners.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just want to move very, very quickly on to another issue that Calvin Bailey's going to raise.
Okay, at the moment, the UK engages with its European partners through OCCAR. How does this compare with the benefits and costs of engaging with the European Defence Fund? Kevin?
I actually don't know the answer to that, Mr. Bailey. I'm very happy to come back to the committee with some detail on that, if I may, rather than speculate.
Yeah, that would be very, very helpful. Actually, I'm going to make a request of you after the other two individuals have responded.
My answer is the same as Kevin's, I'm afraid. I simply don't know. I think the only experience we've got of OCCAR is the Boxer programme, the mechanised infantry vehicle programme, which I think has had some benefits and disbenefits. If you look at the supply chain, all of the engineering drawings and technical documents were all in German when they came out of OCCAR. So every single UK SME that bid for work received their technical documentation in the German language, and all had to translate. I don't think that was OCCAR's fault, but that's just a little example.
Linguistic skills.
Mindful of time, we'll leave it. Airbus, I think we'll have a response for you, Kevin.
Thank you, sir.
That's an area of great interest to them. The European Defence Fund, then, period. Engagement and interaction.
I think it's a must-have, frankly. We do represent a significant part of Europe's defence industrial capacity. They want us. Their industrialists want us, and they want our capabilities as well. So, we just have to find the political means to build that defence and industrial security pact.
Right,
I would echo that comment.
David, just briefly, brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much. It would be, on the issues around OCCAR, I think it would be very, very good if we can get written submission. And also, would you be willing to share your submissions to the Defence Industrial Strategy with the committee as well, if you could please write to us, and that way we could then delve further into what should and shouldn't be done. But it, I think, has been an enthralling, very, very informative session, and no doubt that will help to further inform public opinion and debate, especially within the House. Thank you very much, Mr. Craven, Mr. David, and Mr. Kinniburgh, for taking time out of your valuable diaries to formally give evidence at today's hearing session on UK's contribution to European security. And with that, I bring this hearing of the Defence Committee to an end. Order.